Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. Today we will be learning a special trick of how to find the number of squares and rectangles. Let's get started. Okay, say we have a figure like this, and the figure goes till here. Okay, and we'll divide it by 3. We'll make 3 equal columns and 3 equal rows. Okay, so now let's say the question says, how many squares? How many squares? So if we wanted to go by just counting them, saying like, okay, this is 1, this is 2, this is 3, this is 4, that would take too long, right? So there's a trick that I would use. So we'll label the amount of columns. So this is one column, this is the second column, and this is the third column. Okay, and now the trick is we do 1 squared plus 2 squared plus 3 squared, and that gives us 14. And that's our answer. So that's how we find how many squares are in the given figure. So now, assuming that these are squares, I know it's not like, I know this is a rectangle, but I couldn't draw an exact square. But assuming this is a square, this would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So that would be 14, right? So that's another way. And a key thing to remember about this concept, it only works if number of rows equals number of columns. That's an important thing to remember, because here we have 3 rows right here, and then 3 rows. We have 3 rows right here and 3 columns right here. So that's why this trick works. Okay. Now let's move on to, what if we have an uneven number of rows and columns? So let's go to that. So this is going to be a square. We're going to assume that these are squares. I can't really draw exact squares, but that's alright. Okay. Oh, wait. Okay. Say that's our this is our rectangle. They're asking us to find the amount of squares inside of them. Okay, so the trick I would use here is, well, as we can see, we have 1, 2, 3 columns and 2 rows. So the trick I would use to find the number of squares, so this is squares, squares, squares. The trick I would use is to write the amount of columns multiplied by the amount of rows. So 3 times 2. And then we'd add, and then on the next one we would do 3 minus 1, which would give us 2, and then 2 minus 1, which would give us 1, plus 1 times 0, and that would be it. Once we get to 0, we know that this anyways would be 0, so it won't matter. So that's when we stop. So this might look confusing, so let me write it out. So we'll start off with columns times, we'll go times rows, plus column minus 1 times rows minus 1 plus columns minus 1 times rows minus 1, and then so on until we reach column or row equals 0. Once we reach 0, that's the end of it, because that would just equal 0 and that wouldn't have any value to our sum. Okay, so let's work this out. So let's bring this down here and let's work it out. So 3 times 2 would be 6. Okay, 2 times 1 would be 2. plus, well, this would obviously be 0, so we don't have to worry about that. But I just wrote it so that I know when to stop. So it's a good strategy to have plus 0. So if we add all these, we get 8. So that's how many squares are in this. So this strategy only works if number of columns does not equal number of rows. So this is a strategy if you don't have equal number of rows and columns. Because in the previous example we had 3 rows, 3 columns. Here we only have 2 rows and 3 columns. Okay, so that's how you find squares. But what if they're asking you to find rectangles? What would we do? Well, we could just, let's create a rectangle right here. Let's make it like this. We'll go 1 right here, and we'll make 1 right here. I'm making them even on purpose, just so it gives us a variety. Okay, so now this time they're not asking us for squares, but they're asking us for rectangles. How many rectangles do we have? Okay, so this strategy is similar to the first one about squares that we learned. There has to be equal number of columns and rows. So we have 1, 2, 3 columns and 1, 2, 3 rows. So this strategy, instead of squaring the number of columns we have, we would in fact cube them. So we would do 1 cubed plus 2 cubed plus 3 cubed. And if we add all of those up, we get 36. So that's how many rectangles are in this. So this strategy, we basically just take number of columns and cube the amount. So let me write something. Let me write an important note to the side. Only works if number of columns equals number of rows. That's an important thing to remember. Okay. Now, let's say we have an unequal number of rows and columns. So let's say we have a rectangle that looks like this. Okay, so this rectangle would have 2 rows, 3 columns. Okay, and they're asking us for rectangles. Okay, they're asking us for rectangles. So basically what we have to do here is, let me go down a little bit. So we take the number of, let me write this actually. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Okay, so basically we would do is we add the columns. So we would do 2 plus 1. Sorry, 2 plus, hold up. 1 plus 2 plus 3. And then we would multiply. And then we would add the number of rows. So we would do 2 plus 1. And that's how we would get the number of rectangles in an uneven. So let's work this out. So 1 plus 2 plus 3, that's 6. And then 2 plus 1 is 3. So we do 6 times 3, which would give us 18. So we would actually have 18 rectangles in this entire figure. So let's write another important thing. So the important thing to remember in this one is, let me do it in a different color. Only works if number of columns not equal to number of rows. Okay, so let me go over this again. This basically is showing us add columns, multiply by, multiply by, add rows. So basically we would multiply the sum of the columns and the sum of the rows, and you would basically get the amount of rectangles in the figure if the number of columns and rows are uneven. Okay, so let's review. Let's start from this. If we have an equal number of rows and columns and they're asking us to find the number of squares, we would just take the number of columns and square each number. So we do 1 squared plus 2 squared plus 3 squared if there are 3 columns, and then we would add them up. If there are an uneven number of rows and columns and they're asking us to find the number of squares, what we would do is we would do 3 times 2, so columns times rows, and then we would add a column minus 1 times row minus 1. So you would get 2 times 1, and then we would do plus column minus 1 times row minus 1 until we reach one of the values equals 0. Because once we reach 0, 0 times any number is 0. So then we would add them all up and we would get our answer. So in this case we had the answer as 8 squares in the entire figure. What if we have equal number of rows and columns and they're asking us for rectangles? Well, we would do the same thing as the first step if we had equal number of rows and columns for squares, except we would cube them. So we would do 1 cubed plus 2 cubed plus 3 cubed if there are 3 columns, and we would get our answer. And then if we have an uneven number of columns and rows, then we would, if for rectangles, then we would just do 1 plus 2 plus 3, add the number of columns, multiply that by 2 plus 1, or the number of rows. And then we'd multiply them and we'd get 18. So sum of the columns times sum of the rows. And that's our answer. Okay, so that would be it for today's video. Thank you so much for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. I'm really trying to reach my goal of 1K subs. Thank you.